Hi everyone, and welcome today to RSPCA Burwood for the launch of our 2024 advocacy goals. My name is Rebecca Cook, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. I know that we have people here in the room, and we also have people online. So we'll be monitoring the chat online just to check if people have questions. Just a few little bits of housekeeping. In the event of a fire, there's the exit. I feel like a bit of a flight attendant. The toilets around the back there towards the entrance that you may have come in today. And I wanted to let people know that we're also recording today. So your questions, if you pose questions, will be recorded. Before we kick off though, I'd like to, at RSPCA Victoria, we acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this nation. Our meeting today is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So we've got a really fantastic lineup for you today. We'll probably be, I think, the formal part of the proceedings will be about 40 minutes. We will have, we're going to have a fantastic presentation from Robin Scott, who I'm going to present in a moment. Then he will be talking about the current state of the Victorian political landscape and opportunities for organisations advocating for change. And then we'll have Dr. Liz Walker, our CEO, who's going to officially launch our advocacy goals for this year. And then we'll have time for a question and answer. And if you're online, you can send through questions on the Zoom chat or through the Q&A, and we'll be able to see those. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Robin Scott. We did originally advertise that Cosmaris was going to be presenting today. Unfortunately, he's unable to be here, but I'm very pleased to let you know the wonderful Robin Scott is here with us to discuss, as I said before, the Victorian political landscape. Robin is a former Australian politician representing the seat of Preston for the Victorian Labor Party over 16 years. He's served as a Shadow Minister for Finance, and then Minister for Finance, Minister for Multicultural Affairs, and Minister for Veterans, as well as the Assistant Treasurer. So he may know some things about funding, if anyone's got any questions. Throughout his career, he has a really unique insight into the inner workings of the Labor government, who have been in power for the last 10 years. So if everyone would like to give Robin a warm welcome.
Thanks very much. What I'll talk about today is sort of some of the change that's occurring in the political landscape. We go to the next slide, thank you. We're going through a period actually of quite radical change. There's significant declines in the primary vote of major political parties in structural terms. It can fall up and down a bit, but that's a strong structural churn. And that's linked in part to different behaviours from younger voters. People talk about particularly Generation Z and millennial voters who are coming through. And that's transforming the political debate quite radically over time. But when you're living through change, it's just normal. The sun rises, you go out and make a cup of tea. Oh, I'm a tea drinker, so you have a cup of tea in the morning. But actually, this is a period of profound change. Next slide. If you look at this as change, if you go back a bit over 10 years, millennials were a minor demographic, and baby boomers and people older than baby boomers dominated. And now I could give you some figures. There are more millennials than there are baby boomers in Australia now. And between Gen Z and millennials, I'm a Gen Xer, so we sit between what I'm talking about. But you've got now more of those younger demographics in the old demographic. So there's profound social attitude changes in attitudes to trust. We're going through revolutionary change in how we communicate, how we receive information, how we perceive the world. Just move on to the next slide. And there are concerns of those younger generations which very much align to the issues that are raised by organisations like the RSPCA. There's very strong concern for the rights of animals. And there's a strong desire that those processes not to be politicised. There's a strong desire that people have decisions made on the best evidence. There's a lot of debates around science, and there's a lot of things on. I'll get on to online and trust and and mainstream media in a second, but these are strongly held positions that are important to people, and you see it in people's consumer behaviour. I was looking through some of the things. I mean, I don't think, and you can generalise. So of course there are older members of the society who also are concerned with that. Many who are concerned about animals, but you can see the changes that are occurring. We are going through. I don't know everyone here would know that Thomas Kuhn's theory of paradigms, but I think we're genuinely going through paradigmic changes in people's attitudes, and that there are ideas for which what I mean by that is that there are ideas for which the intellectual foundations no longer really apply. They hang on. That's what paradigm discussions are really about. They hang on beyond the point to which their justification is no longer supported by the evidence. That's not to say the issues aren't complex, and it's not to say that they're not difficult things to manage in terms of interests, but within the society and competing ideas and competing goods. But it is important to understand we've got a new generation coming through. They're changing the nature of political representation with larger numbers of independents, larger numbers of people from non-mainstream, not the mainstream political parties of sort of 30, 40 years ago coming through and getting elected to parliaments. And this is happening at the same time where the attitudes and issues of those younger voters are increasingly concerned about post-material issues as well as material desires. Now, while we're living through a cost of living crisis at the moment with high levels of inflation, sort of a post-COVID hangover, there are still those trends. You know, these things will bob up and down if you look at it on a graph, but there's those fundamental trends that are coming through. We'll go to the next slide. And then you get to the attitude of trust. And so if you look at this is younger voters, 18 to 39, so in that sort of millennial Gen Z voters. They don't trust governments to make the right decisions. There's a lack of trust towards traditional institutions. And they also, so they don't, it's a combination of a lack of, they don't trust, but they don't, and there's only a small minority. So that's a significant change in Western societies. If you roll back to the 1950s or 60s, you had much higher levels of trust in institutions to make decisions. And in fact, if you watch, you know, on YouTube, you can watch almost anything. If you watch media interviews from those sort of eras, they're so differential. People defer to authority. The nature of people's relationship with the institutions that are powerful within society is fundamentally changing. And that's an accelerating change. So there's a lack of trust. People don't trust. And so it's only really a quarter of people who trust political process to make the right decisions about issues which are often things they passionately care about. I mean, that is a really big issue for society, and it presents for people who are members of sort of a political active group. And you often, I'm sure, in your own ways, are politically active, but think of those who are seeking positions of power as opposed to those who are seeking positions of influence on power. So there's a subtle difference. They then belong to a subgroup of people who are fundamentally not trustable. And that presents a series of challenges for people in those roles. And essentially the thesis, and we'll move on to the next slide. I'll come back to this next, I'll keep going on. That presents a really important opportunity because people are self-aware in those environments. I mean, there's lots of limitations of that life, and politics is a very all-encompassing life. And it's very 24/7. People are in that world their entire waking life. Often, you know, the phone rings whatever time. People WhatsApp messages usually late at night, these days rather than phone ringing. But it's incredibly encompassing their life. But they're aware that they're not trusted by people. They're aware that they have a fundamental credibility gap, as the term used, I think, in another context, and that they're aware that they are not, that it is a trend of decline, trust, and that they need intermediaries. And then you look at the media and how people interpret events. You've got something very interesting happening. You've got a decline in the mainstream media where very few people trust what they read in the mainstream media from those younger generations. Oh, sorry, I've got a cold as well. So there's very few people who trust what they're reading in the mainstream media. But and if you look at behavioural change, people are much more getting their news from things like social media, a forum they trust even less. So think about this cycle where you've got institutions, and I think these are interrelated issues, where people within positions of power and authority are increasingly not trusted, particularly by younger people. There's a decline in mainstream media, which is not trusted. And there's a replacement of that mainstream media with something which is trusted even less. And I think people are onto something, because with this, we're not having a discussion here about social media, but algorithm manipulation is a real thing. People realise when you're going onto a social media platform, you're selling yourself, like you are the product. You're not paying for it because you're being sold, and your wants, desires, and needs and behaviours are being sold to people to manipulate you into purchasing things. But secondly, or purchasing your time, actually, on various sides. But for a process of dopamine addiction cycles. But then, what does that mean? So if you're losing, you are institutions, and I'm working from the premise that people in this room want to influence decision makers in order to change how the society relates to the animals and the most vulnerable animals, to ensure that there's a shift that gives greater regard to the needs of those animals who have no direct voice in the decision-making process. So it needs advocates like the people here in this room. So there's this gap. Go to the next slide. But there are groups that are trusted. NGOs who operate, the research shows, without a direct profit motive, who are seen to be doing good for others, are trusted. Advocacy bodies, super funds, and these are all organisations that are here to help other people or animals in the case of the RSPCA. And you've got negatives, corporate, the media, social media, politicians. So it may not seem this way to many of you sometimes, but the authority that you have, if you look at trust, is actually stronger than the people who have direct authority in the society in the context of trust, and who's regarded as a trustworthy source, and who's regarded as acting in a way that is reflective of the values that people want to aspire to. And this means that the people I was describing earlier, who belong to sort of an activist class within politics, want some of that reflected trust, because they're in a scenario where their trust in them and the organisations they represent is declining, whether that be the state, whether it be their political party. But my apologies, I've got a cold. But their interlocutors, there are these other organisations which are trusted sources of information. So I think if I was to give a simple piece of advice in terms of advocacy in this scenario, so I've given a reasonably this is a bit more esoteric than the discussion of the ins and outs of Spring Street in Victoria, but I think you'd want that. That you have something that's critically important and valuable. Because there's lots of research, and in one of the other roles, apart from with the Red Bridge I'm here representing today, I work at a social policy research institute at Deakin University. Trust is actually an amazingly effective predictor of how successful a society is. You can look at a poll of how much people trust institutions of the society and other members of the society, and you can essentially plot on a graph, and it relates to things like happiness, life expectancy, wealth, in a really direct way. Now, there's lots of arguments in what way the causation lies, but I think there's strong evidence that trusting societies do a lot better than societies that there's a lack of trust. So the currency that you hold is a really powerful one, and that people will want to work with you and get your, ultimately, the relationship that comes from productive relationships where there's a public enunciation of ideas and shared outcomes. Because some of the trust that's held by the organisations which still retain trust within the society can rub off on those institutions which are in decline. in terms of level of trust. I mean, I think it is absolutely critical, by the way, and it's a topic I won't go into in great detail, but we find a way to stop having declining levels of trust. But I mean, that ultimately leads to really bad outcomes. But one of the simple advantages of the current crisis is that for those who are still held as holding high levels of trust in the broader community, that is a really powerful thing. So my simple advice to all of you, particularly to the RSPCA as a client of Redbridge, is that you have to think about what you have as a resource and the ability to use that to help advocate on behalf of those, of course, who can have no voice of their own. You know, and let's go to the reality. That's why people trust you. There's an obvious reason. The sort of people who selflessly give up their time and their energy, you know, and I'm sure people have very productive careers at the RSPCA, but I'm sure it's not where you go with your money focus, right? You know, let's see some smiles. There's plenty of other ways to make a living, but you're doing it or giving up your time as volunteers because you have a sense of purpose that comes from your empathy and concern for literally those who have consciousness but are voiceless, who cannot express their pain, cannot express their desires, cannot express their experiences, but need those to advocate for them. And so think about what strengths you have and think about what I was just having a discussion with your CEO about sort of how you advocate change. And it's an empathetic process. There's this crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of trust. In such circumstances, very few people have retained that sense that you can trust them. And so I'd just say you have something that's really important. You're doing things that are very important. And the work can benefit from an understanding of the place that you hold within society, which is quite uncommon. You know, you're not subject to your crime. You know, and you look up, we could have listed traditional churches and a whole range of other institutions. Organisations like the RSPCA have not suffered from the collapse of trust and collapse of participation as well. That most civil society organisations, including political organisations, especially political organisations in the media and other institutions, have suffered in the society. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Robin. Thanks so much, Robin. That was really fascinating. I can't wait till we get to questions in a minute. I've got quite a few myself. Now, I think that sets the scene really well for our CEO, Dr. Liz Walker, to come forward and officially launch our advocacy goals.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And sincere thanks to you all for attending today, whether it's in person or online, or if you're watching later as well. And thanks, Robin, for that really interesting talk. I hadn't really thought about it like that before, so that's very helpful. But at RSPCA, we do advocate to bring about change in policy and practice, and so that we can improve the lives of animals. And our vision is unashamedly to end cruelty to all animals. What that means for us is we have to develop a clear understanding of stakeholders and the decision-making landscape, and so that we can really understand how best to go about our advocacy. So in general, and I think it's really important to talk about how we do it, that means we have to maintain a really good working knowledge of who's making decisions around what issues and how those decisions are going to be made, whether it's political, parliamentary, government processes, or to do with industry. So we do have to monitor the range of views and influences on key issues through continually scanning and working with many stakeholders. So you will see us talking to stakeholders on every side of the debate. And I think that's a really important way that we do advocate. And you know, I will say that we build trusting relationships. So we'll be straight with people. We will tell them what we think, but we'll do it respectfully and no surprises. Before I tell you about our next set of advocacy goals, thought a pulse check might be a good idea. Progress is often hard won in this space. I think probably in many spaces, we're probably not too unusual. And it's often the result of many years of advocacy. We think the next couple of years of advocacy is a pretty exciting time for animals across the state as a number of animal welfare matters continue to be implemented, and that we, I think under this government, we continue to move in the right direction. Let's just see how we've gone with these goals. So when it comes to conventional cages, that says battery cages, it should say conventional cages. They have been, a phase out of conventional cages has been endorsed by all ministers across all state and territories as part of the national poultry standards and guidelines. The duck shooting ban was recommended by the Parliamentary Select Committee, as many of you know, and whilst that was really excellent progress, unfortunately the government made the decision not to support that. Incredibly disappointing. It is what it is. We will press on. The National Traceability Task Force is really exciting. That's something that we're contributing to from Victoria for the whole country, and RSPCA Victoria is participating in that. In the implementation of the system that has been agreed on to date. That's BEC, it represents us there. There's more to come in this space. Mandatory CCTV has been recommended to be put in place across all Victorian abattoirs and pig farms by the Parliamentary Committee into Pig Welfare. Then the animal welfare legislation is being finalised. Can I just say that's fantastic. It's not very often you get to rewrite legislation from the get-go. I'm sure Robin would echo that. This is a total rewrite. So a huge opportunity, enormous investment by government for which they should be commended. We're getting there. It's being finalised, and sentience is going to be recognised, as far as we know, as well as a minimum duty of care, which is very exciting. And the holistic cat management plan is also being developed, and I'm very excited about that. And it was on the back of our advocacy a number of years ago that commitment was made. So the next step you'll see in our next round of advocacy goals. Can't let today go past without noticing the big win nationally, which is the legislative commitment to phase out live export of sheep. That's a really monumental change that will make a really significant difference to sheep in this country. And it's also a good example of how we work on issues that sit outside our key goals to be really agile in what we do. And it's part of the benefit of being part of the RSPCA Federation. So let's talk about our goals for the 2024-2026. I'm going to go through them all each individually. We've got 7 of them. We think that these are the big ticket items for this state. We choose these goals, these targets based on the scale and scope of the animal welfare issues, as well as the potential to achieve change. By setting ourselves these 7 goals, we hope that we can get some real wins for animals in this state. We'll do that through our advocacy in the usual way, building those trust-based relationships, using the evidence and being ethical. We work directly with decision makers and influencers, including industry, so that we can really make a difference to animal welfare policy, management and legislation. So let's have a look at them one by one. I'm conscious of the time, so we'll whip through them and then we can ask any questions. The wildlife regs are laws that govern how hunters in Victoria can and cannot act. RSPCA is opposed to hunting of any animal for sport because of the unnecessary injury, pain and suffering that it will cause. However, as with everything else at RSPCA, if it's legal, we will continue to work with the government and industry to do everything we can to mitigate the animal welfare implications. And so reviewing these regulations is a really good opportunity to make some changes. We've already put in a formal submission to this review. We're advocating for a ban on bow hunting. I imagine some people might think, what, can you still bow hunt? But you can. And so it's really important that we actually seek a ban on this, because the suffering is unacceptable. We also think mandating a maximum shooting distance, because the further away it is, the more likely you are to miss and cause injury. Removing duck species that are threatened, such as the Australasian shoveler, and introducing mandatory hunter education, training, shooting and proficiency testing. And that has fallen off the back of the inquiry into the hunting of native birds as well. So we'll be there working on that too. So these initiatives do have the potential to substantially reduce the pain and suffering of animals that are hunted. Our wildlife work is not going to stop there. We'll also be talking to government about restarting the review of the Wildlife Act 1975. That's even older than Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. And there was some work started on that a number of years ago. We would love to see that get moving again, so that we can give our native species the protection they deserve. On to poultry standards. It has been a very long process to get here. It's taken around about 8 years to develop the poultry standards and guidelines. But last year, they were endorsed by all the state and territory agriculture ministers, which is really good. What this means, though, is that until they sort of mean nothing until they're actually accepted into the state and territory legislation. So we think that needs to happen as soon as possible. We understand the government in Victoria intends to do that, but until they do, there's around about 10 million birds in this country that are still living in conventional cages. They don't have the ability to have a good life. They can't easily walk, they can't flap their wings, they can't perch. They have an average amount of space per bird of about an A4 piece of paper. And we know that they suffer from things such as problematic bone structure, frustration, abnormal behaviour. So they can't have a good physical life or a good mental life. The standards mandate a phase out by 2036. We would love that to be done sooner, but what we really want is that certainty in the legislation, and that will help drive some really important change. There's some other really good things about these standards that need to come into the legislation as well. Things like provision of water for ducks in production systems so that they can engage in those preening and natural behaviours that ducks like to do. And provision of enrichment and access to appropriate substrate for pecking and foraging and scratching for our poultry species. So we're looking forward to getting that into the legislation to provide everyone with certainty. The next one is on the horse traceability system. Horses are one of those interesting species, you know. They're pretty much, compared to other livestock and companion animal species, they're relatively unregulated. In fact, there's no mandatory identification system or registration system, and we really don't even know how many we've got. We estimate in Victoria there's probably around 600,000 of them. So you might say, well, why is this a problem? But so here's why. If there's an emergency, including, so it could be a natural emergency or it might just be a number of horses are suffering, it's essential that we can contact the owner quickly so we can either get them moved or get them treated. Our inspectors receive across the country thousands of reports about horse welfare every year, often due to lack of feed, water or shelter. They need rapid action, but it can be very tricky to figure out who actually owns the horses. Furthermore, if there was an incidence of biosecurity relevance, which I think we should all be very concerned about, we had equine influenza here in 2007, I think. That could be catastrophic for horses, for industry, for people. That could cost this country billions. Not to mention the terrible animal welfare ramifications. So in April last year, there was a National Horse Traceability and Implementation Task Force set up to oversee the implementation of the system. It's based on PIC numbers, which is property identification codes. Beck is on that implementation committee, It's fair to say that what we're implementing this time around is not quite where we'd like it to be, but in the spirit of being RSPCA, we're staying at the table, helping that happen, and we're moving forward. What we would like ideally is that horses are individually identified with microchips and that there's a national database and there's a system that allows us to trace animals where they're going, so that we can respond if they're in trouble or if there's a biosecurity event or a natural emergency. On to pigs. Pig farming is one of the most intensive of all livestock farming systems that we have, and there are some welfare concerns that we think we need to take note of and do better of. The following are listed here: phasing out of sow stalls and conventional farrowing crates. So this is a sow stall here. You see that that sow there can't turn around. She can stand up and sit down, and not a great deal else, because their movement is severely restricted. We think they should be provided more enrichment opportunities. Pigs are very intelligent creatures, and there's a whole lot of painful procedures that are conducted as part of piglet husbandry, in particular, like teeth clipping, and we think there should be mandatory pain relief for those things. The recent parliamentary inquiry provides a really good opportunity for us to deliver on those changes. We made a submission and we were really pleased to see that the majority of our asks were in the official report. The government now has 6 months to respond to the report and indicate whether or not it's going to implement the recommendations. So now is a really key time for us to keep those discussions going. On to cat management. I'm sure there's lots of people in this room and in the audience who really love their cats. And I certainly have 2 at home. But the fact is that whilst they make our lives better, they can also breed really quickly. They're often not reclaimed. Maybe 8 to 10% of cats are reclaimed in the system. And when they're lost, and they're widely recognised as a significant threat to our native fauna. So in good news, the government has been working on a cat management strategy for owned and unowned cats, and that's in its final stages. We're very excited to see that. We've been consulting with the government on that and other stakeholders around that, particularly our animal welfare colleagues. And we want to make sure that the strategy considers the different welfare needs and approaches that both owned cats, semi-owned cats, unowned cats, and feral cats might need, because they're different cohorts of cats. So some of those things look like desexing across the state, supporting containment activities, and introducing systems that facilitate collaboration across groups so that we actually target areas where the biggest problems are, so we can really make a difference. And there's also a need for funding research into the control of feral cats. So feral cats are the guys that live in the bush. They have nothing to do with humans. And they have a devastating impact on our native fauna. Having that funded is super critical, because otherwise, clearly, it will just be shelfware. Jumps racing. We've talked about this before. I think what's really important here is that Victoria is the only state or territory that allows jumps racing. The problem that we have, and it's unusual, you've seen a lot of things here where we're talking about improving animal welfare. So when RSPCA says we need to ban something, that really means something. And what that means is that in our view, there is the current state of animal welfare is unacceptable, and there is nothing further that can be done to mitigate the animal welfare implications. So the only solution is to stop it. So the problem with jumps racing is a significant and unavoidable risk of injury and death that this form of racing entails for horses. So you probably know it involves racing horses at high speeds over obstacles, and often involves horses that have moved on to that form of racing from flats racing. Compared to flats racing, the risk of trauma is 4 times more likely in jumps racing. Risk of lameness is 2.5 times in hurdles and about 5.1 times in steeple races. We know that the industry has tried really hard to improve welfare for these horses, but it hasn't made sufficient progress that we think is acceptable. And we don't think that the risk of injury and death to these animals, the rate at which it is acceptable. and therefore we'll be advocating for a ban. We also know that the community is not that aware of jumps racing, and we are conscious that it happens in certain areas of the state, particularly Warrnambool, and we know that that's important too. But something you can do for us is if, as we go along in this journey, is start to talk to your community, your families and friends about why this matters so much. Finally, there's some need for R&D. There's a number of things, lots of things actually in animal welfare where we simply don't have the answers, or what we're actually doing doesn't deliver good animal welfare, but we're not quite sure what better looks like. So we have to make some investment in this. So investing in R&D is something that we think is really important. The priority areas for research that we have is for humane methods of stunning of pigs. Slaughter of pigs is inherently difficult, and you might have seen that on the television program that led to the Senate inquiry into pig farming. We are really concerned about avian influenza in this country. Avian influenza has been around for more than 30 years, but we're at a heightened risk right now. And it's not just for our domestic poultry species, it's also for our wildlife that we need to actually look at what we can do to minimise the impact of avian influenza and prevent it causing more damage than it might otherwise do. And the other area that we think is really important is to look at more humane alternatives to current baits and fumigations that are available for feral rabbit control, because what we currently have available right now is still not terribly humane, and we think there might be some other opportunities to make controlling those animals more humane, but we need the research to be done. So I think that just about wraps them up. That was a whistle-stop tour of our advocacy guidelines, advocacy goals. So we're going to move into a stage of questions, aren't we now, Beck? So I think we're going to ask Robin.
I know that I've seen that we've got a couple of questions coming through online, but we'll also have a roving mic as well. If you want to ask a question, just signal at Erin, and I'll come sit down here. And Ruby is our research and policy officer. So
hello, everyone.
Who hasn't met Ruby before. And my greatest delight is that Mari, many of you would know Mari, who's our policy and advocacy manager. Unfortunately, she is unwell today, but that means she's joining us virtually, which I'm hoping someone's going to ask her a question so her head appears the size of this screen. It'll be fabulous.
Great.
Ruby's going to ask the questions that we've got up.
Well, we've got some great questions already coming through, so we'll just get started. According to Robin, advocacy groups are trusted and wield a certain degree of power, which is attractive to untrusted groups like politicians. Has the RSPCA considered directly endorsing political parties that support animal welfare and discouraging support for parties that don't?
We do what I can say is that we do a scorecard prior to the election and show where each party sits in relation to our priorities. I would probably be interested to ask Robin what he thinks in terms of would we be, you're sort of backing yourself into a corner, aren't you?
I mean, my honest advice would be there's some risk in directly advocating votes within a political process in terms of there's some risks with directly endorsing like political parties or candidates, because the role that the RSPCA plays is a little more than an advocacy role. There's a whole range of sort of quasi-official really roles within relationship to the state. So I think it would be quite a difficult thing for the RSPCA to directly. I think and once you're in the direct day-to-day politics in a way of direct, so that's seen as partisan, I think no one would say the RSPCA is a partisan political organisation. Some of that trust would decline.
I might chip in on that, so I have some very clear views.
I think that one of the things that I'm really conscious of, I hadn't thought about it exactly the way Robin said, but We enjoy incredibly high trust and confidence from the community. It's around about 80%. And we're founded on animal welfare science. And that's why I work here, because I love animals and I think we should be trying to do our best for them. But the science really matters. I think those animal welfare policies and science are where we need to go with it, and we're not going to agree with everyone all the time. But I also, I think that our scorecard, our advocacy goals and our scorecard is where we can actually provide, support or otherwise for different parties who choose to support what our advocacy goals are.
Can I just also add to that? You might need to stop the PowerPoint, Ruby, if you want people in the room to see my giant head. Hello, everyone. We also cannot endorse political parties because we would lose our charity status. So we also have to be really, I suppose, apolitical in what we do so that, we don't lose that status. And thank you to Jan, who's also pointed that out in the chat online. So we're registered with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, and there are rules around how charities can operate, and part of that is really around being apolitical. So providing scorecards for political parties across the board and how they might rate when looking at our advocacy goals is something that we can do, but we can't directly endorse a political party.
Great. We got a question from the audience.
Thank you, animals. In terms of the ducks, firstly, question, how many species of ducks are on the endangered species list, and how many are there called that's still used in guns polluting our waterways? And how do we get the hunters to stop to make sure that they take their dogs home? In other words, I've heard stories that duck shooters deliberately leave their dogs out of the country. There must be something that we can do in terms of education, Rita. And Rita, poor old pigs, I hope to God it ends, that same ends.
Thanks, Gillian. I might just see, Mari, do you want to answer some of those questions and I might chime in later?
Yes, I did miss a little bit of it, so I will try my best. In terms of duck species, I think the question was around how many are threatened. Is that right? That are on the
That's right.
list. So there are 9 duck species that can be hunted in Victoria. One of those is currently listed under the National EPBC Act, so it's listed as a threatened species. One has just been removed from that list, so I would say it's still not in a great way, numbers-wise, abundance-wise. So our view would be that you shouldn't be able to hunt that species either because it really needs time to recover. In the proposed 2024 wildlife game regulations, they have suggested that one of those species that's currently listed as threatened should have a permanent close season. Our view is that it should be removed from the game list entirely because that's really not sufficient to protect that species. And we think at a minimum, the other species, the hardhead, which has only just been removed from being classed as threatened, should also, at a minimum, have a permanent close season. In terms of, I think the question was around hunting dogs being left, is that right?
That's right.
My understanding is that all hounds need to be registered with the Game Management Authority. I'm not aware of, I suppose, instances where they might be left places, but that would be a breach of our Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. That would be classed as abandonment, so that is very much illegal. And so if people were aware of hunters doing that, they should report that because that is something that can be investigated. We do know that in the game regulations, I would say the regulations that relate to hounds specifically and their welfare really need some more work. And so we've made some recommendations around those as well to have some more protections for hounds in hunting too.
Great. Okay, we've got another online question. Why has Victoria failed to get on board with banning jumps racing?
Well, I think we are on board with banning jumps racing because that's one of our goals for this year. I might just pass it on to Beck because she looks like she wants to say something.
Yeah, I think that the key issue with jumps racing, when we've polled Victorians, is that they don't know a lot about it. Unlike other types of racing, it doesn't seem to have the same high profile as other types of racing. And in fact, when we polled Victorians, they don't actually know that it goes on in Victoria. So our task is to really make people aware of what's going on and then leverage off that, I think. I think that's why we've not seen the same movement in Victoria or the same sort of pressure that's been in other states and territories. I don't know, Robin, do you have a thought on that?
I would agree with that. I think that there is broad ignorance about jumps racing, except in those communities where they have jumps, in country areas where they have jumps events where there's actually reasonably high levels of support for jumps racing. So although when the principle, I think it's a classic case of, I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but my supposition would be relatively low levels of support for the concept if it's explained, but people don't have an awareness of it. And where there is awareness, there's a localized economic interest around jumps racing.
Great. So we've got another online. So someone is quite concerned about the inundation of abandoned and surrendered dogs and is just wondering what is going to be done for these rescue organisations as it's quite concerning at the moment.
In terms of, sorry, is the question about rescues being inundated or?
Yeah, rescues being inundated. Yeah.
Did you want to talk about what we're planning in terms of the 2030 strategy, Dr. Liz, in terms of where we're moving?
Look, I think this is a really significant problem that we're living with right now, in that there does seem to be high rates of people who want to surrender their animals. We get between 400 and 600 calls a month that's a lot of people, right, who are calling to say they want to surrender their animal, even if they're calling back a few times. It's a lot of animals. We're struggling to help as many people as we'd like to because we have some commitments around council contracts and we're full. And over the next couple of years, we've told councils that we're going to be moving away from running pound contracts per se, and they will run their own, so that we can free up capacity to help animals where animals are really vulnerable, and they're people too, and they need to surrender them. We try really hard to support people to keep their animals if they want to do that, because we know that animals make our lives better, and oftentimes surrendering an animal is a heartbreaking experience for them, and they're doing it because for financial reasons or accommodation reasons or other sorts of reasons. And if we can help them, we will. There's certainly some real pressure on the rescue groups, and that's another reason why we are full. We have wonderful relationships with rescue groups, but they can only take so many as well. There is the rehoming task force that's being run through the state government, which is endeavouring to provide more structure and support to the rescue sector and how it interfaces with organisations like ours. So I hope that will actually provide some of the solutions as well. But some of this, I think, is a reflection of the cost of living crisis that we're seeing. So we, like everything else, we're just doing our best.
Great. We've got some questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you so much for running us through the initiatives. They look really good. Dogs are really close to my heart. I do volunteer with dogs. Excuse my voice as well. I'm just coming back from a cold. I'm just wondering, in terms of the legal actions.
Thanks for the presentation today. It's been terrific. I know that you've got quite a lot of animals that you've had to, what's the right word? Confiscate from bad owners, and it seems to take forever to get them through the court system. Is there any initiative that you can come up with that would perhaps have a separate court, if you like, for animal welfare issues, or any way of hurrying up and speeding up the process so that you can get your animals back out into the community again?
Might be able to talk to some of the, Mara, you might be able to talk to some of the changes in POPTA that we've been advocating for.
Yeah, I think as part of the new legislation, so the proposed bill, we've actually recommended that some sentencing guidelines be developed that would support magistrates in their decision making. So giving them some guidance about what appropriate penalties might be, and it might include some advice there around how to better manage animals, because we know it is a really tricky space because they are treated as evidence, which is really difficult because it does mean we have to hold them for long periods of time. But there are mechanisms in place as well that we can already use under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act in terms of gaining ownership of animals so that we can move them through the system more quickly and get them to their forever homes. I can't imagine that there would be much of an appetite to have a completely different system to look at animal cruelty cases, but I think it's really just about providing the information and supporting the judiciary to help them make those, to have that knowledge to make those decisions.
Thanks, Mars. Do we have?
Great.
I just want to let you know that Robin's going to go in 5 minutes. So if there's anyone's got a particular question, up the back from Wildlife Vic. I'm not surprised.
Front of the queue. Thank you. Robin, I'm just interested in that slide where you talked about the trust in NGOs and super funds and advocacy bodies versus the corporates and the government agencies. Is there any kind of, does partnering dilute that trust in any way?
I think depends on the partnership, and so this is, I think, a really good question. So I think there's nothing wrong with engaging with people who you need to get change from, and the decisions, as long as you're careful how to do it. And I'll give a careful answer, but I think it's a great question. So you don't want to be seen to be cynical and engaging in sort of power politics type situations if you want to maintain sort of some of that. So there's sort of like that's part of it. You don't want to be just a partisan actor in a sort of process that's held in less and less trust in the society. So I think it's really important to engage in a way that conveys the values, which is and why, think about why you trust it, and you have to, I think, engage in such a way that those values are clear in those engagements. So that doesn't mean it's a world free of compromise, because you won't get much done if you're in direct engagement. There's never any compromise. I'm going to give you that piece of advice, but it's you've got to be careful. I think I'd say that. So, and how you engage, in what circumstances you engage, and how you ensure that the values that underpin the organisation, which have ensured that it's got greater levels of trust, are not compromised in a fundamental way by that engagement. So, and people, I think, are quite forgiving of advocacy organisations having a win. It's not everything they'd want. They're less forgiving of advocacy organisations who abandon their core principles in order to curry favour. I'd sort of put it that way. So there's nothing wrong with getting a win that 20% of the 100% you'd want and banking the win, and then moving on to advocating for the next 80%, mind you, right? As long as people trust you, you're doing that. I think that's a really important thing. So there's some people who never want to bank the 20% and will reject everything but 100% of what they want, and they don't tend to get as much done, if I sort of give that. But it is really important that people see you as having fidelity to the underlying commitment to where you want to get to. and the change we'll make within society. So I'd sort of, yeah, so I think you just need that subtlety of understanding that you can have small wins. And sometimes it's really great because they often open the door for bigger wins later as well. And rejecting the idea of unless you get everything you want to having any engagement, I think is a mistake. That's a personal view, but they have to believe you're on that journey still. You know, and if you're just another actor who's trying to get to who's sort of like seen as just another person who'd sell out their ideas for something. And that can sometimes be unfair on perceptions about people who are selling out, but who aren't actually. But you just got to be cognizant that people have to maintain that trust in you. But if they say you've had a win and you're still committed to winning the rest of the things that you want, the reason they support you, I think you can do that.
Right. I might.
Great. Should we do one more from the audience?
Oh, I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
Are there any initiatives in the new strategy around working with legislators to ban backyard breeders and in that sense, like help out with abandonment rates and rescues and so forth?
Well, I think that the breeding, the legislation that we currently have that went through in December 2017 goes a long way for that. We are seeing, and so right now Victoria has probably the strongest laws around breeding. And it does mean that you have to have a domestic animal business if you aren't one of the major organisations like Dogsvic, who are here today, and you know, they can have slightly more animals, but everyone needs a source code. Everyone needs to actually all animals that are born need to have their source code and their owner, where they're from on their microchip. It does feel to me that perhaps what we might need to do is a bit of an education campaign for people to really highlight that if there's no source code, there's no sale, and if there's problems, to report it. Right now, I think what we're seeing is supply and demand seems to be a bit out of kilter, and I think that's a real problem. So I think that's a problem that we need to continue to address, and we also need to address it nationally because the legislation in other states is not as good as ours, and so puppies and kittens flow in over the border. So we're at risk for that too. So that was a wishy-washy answer. There's nothing in particular is actually part of it.
Great.
Yeah. Certain legislation is great. Good step towards and results. But actually enforcing the law is the second step. So are there any initiatives where the public, the community can help out with actually supporting that work that you're doing?
In terms of helping to identify illegal breeding. Well, we have a major investigations team who focus on that, and certainly we could provide some more information on that. But that's really what their one of their key focuses is. So we have a dedicated team. So we could definitely look at more education and communication about that work and how to get in touch with them if you have concerns.
I think, you know, we have a tip line on our website that says if you hear something, but also I think so you can if people become aware that there's advertising going on or there's people doing something that seems scurrilous, they need to report it. They can either report it to us or they can report it to the department if it's a source code issue. You know, we can't do anything unless we know. And I think that's really important. If source codes don't make sense, or if people are saying, meet us at a bus stop to pick up the animal, that is a huge red flag, and we need to know about that.
So, yeah, look, I'm just conscious of time. We are coming up to 5:05, so we've got quite a few questions. Maybe we can just do a couple more from online, and then we'll finish up. But if anybody needs to leave, that's absolutely fine.
But feel free to, if you want to ask questions at the end, feel free. We'll be hanging around, have something to eat.
Strategy.
Yes, yep,
Okay.
we'll
We'll-
get to that.
We'll just do a couple from online just to give them a voice. So is there a reason you're focusing on game regulations to change and not just an outright ban towards duck hunting, as it's already banned in other states?
Sure, talk to that. So, I'm sure, I know there's a lady at the back with a fabulous duck jumper on, so I'm sure that she knows this as well. But as our friends at Wildlife Vic know as well, we got what we felt was very close to getting a ban for duck hunting. We obviously had it recommended that it be banned. It wasn't banned. We feel that the statements that were made around that in the current environment that we're in, it is unlikely that a ban will happen. So we are instead putting our energy into looking at how we can improve hunters' knowledge and some of the rules and regulations around hunting to try to reduce the wounding rates. So it's not that we have gone off the idea of ending duck hunting. We just need to take a different angle on it because we know that straight let's go for a ban is not going to work in this current environment.
I think it's fair to say that we will continue to say that duck hunting should be banned and why, and of course, and do that and provide feedback around the general cycle of duck hunting season. But the reality is, the political reality is that we think it is that the current government, given what they've come out and said, is simply not going to change their mind in this term of government. So we should influence what we can, and we'll get back to the table in due course to seek that ban.
So we do
Right. One more from online.
And then we
Yeah.
can take a couple. And if anyone needs to leave, we won't be offended if you.
Great. Okay. So our final online question is, given growing community concern for the welfare of animals in the greyhound racing industry, and with effective controls constantly failing or easily bypassed, is it time for the RSPCA to call for a ban on greyhound racing?
I might kick that off and then Mari, you can chime in. I think one of the things I said earlier regarding the ban on horse racing is that for RSPCA to ask for a ban, it means that we think that nothing further can be done to mitigate the animal welfare impacts, and that as they are completely unacceptable. At the moment, our greyhound racing policy says that we recognise that there are some entrenched animal welfare issues with greyhound racing, such as oversupply, injuries, fatalities, and use of substances, etc. That policy is under review. Having said that, in the Victorian instance, and I'm not advocating for anything other than our policy, but at Greyhound Racing Victoria, there has been considerable improvement. So in 2014 and 15, there are, I don't know, it's published, they've been courageous in publishing their results. They euthanized over 3,000 dogs that year, and last year it was 342. So they've clearly made endeavours to improve that. The fatality rate has come down from about 112 to about 40. I know we would all say that 0 would be a good number, but there's clear evidence that there has been improvement. So that's why right now it's not a ban, but as I said, the policy is under review. And may I say that the policy is under review just as part of the regular policy review cycle that happens as part of our RSPCA policies about every 8 years. Mari, is there anything I've missed?
No, I don't think so. I think just to add that the reason why we have focused on jumps racing specifically is, as Liz outlined earlier, because we don't think that they can mitigate the welfare issues in there. So that's why we've, I suppose, chosen for this period of time to really focus in on that issue specifically and not on greyhound racing. But we will continue to advocate for welfare improvements in greyhound racing. We do that regularly. We meet with them regularly, and that work is not going to stop, even though it's not listed as a key focus area on our advocacy goals.
I think just based on time, it's already 5:10, so I think we might just.
Then, to this, with the greatest of respect to microchipping, cats and getting cats back to their owners, the first thing people need to remember, whilst the microchipping may be that one said, systems can go right out of fail. I strongly advocate, please, for people to think about either a printed collar for their dog, will be coming for my dog, not in the not too distant future, and also a good strong key ring. But why won't people trust the system? It's a system where you've got to have some form of wording on the collar. When if people don't
Thanks,
understand,
Julianne.
that's the one way to get them back.
I think that, you know, having some multiple identification forms on your animal is very sensible. So I totally, people should do that. I know there's a question from this lady who's been very patient.
I've got two rabbits, and I know a lot of people have pet rabbits. You know, they take mine to the rabbit doctor, and a lot of people. And do you think there's the likelihood, or do you support the rabbits should be included, domestic rabbits, in the Domestic Animal Act sort of in the future?
Over to you, Mari.
Yes, this has been on my radar for a while. I think rabbits and guinea pigs are covered in the general provisions of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, but not under the Domestic Animals Act. And I know it's definitely, I think something people are becoming more aware of is that councils don't have obligations like they do for dogs and cats to pick up lost or stray rabbits and guinea pigs. And I think, you know, it is something we would support them becoming, you know, managed under the Domestic Animals Act. It has been on my radar for a while that they unfortunately aren't covered. But I think there's probably quite a bit of work that would need to go into kind of working towards that goal.
Hi, I was just going to ask about the issue of dingoes here in Victoria and their treatment.
That's probably a question for Mari.
Yeah, dingoes are really, their management is really interesting. It's really complicated. And I think at the point in which you're considering dingoes and dingo dog hybrids and how they're managed and where they're located, whether they're located adjacent to farmland, also kind of differs in terms of how they're managed. And I think there are a lot of issues with management where they are unprotected. It's probably a tricky question to answer because it is so complicated. Obviously, pure dingoes are a protected species in Victoria. They're a native species, but there are points in time in which they're unprotected, which you know, we don't think they should be. They should be a protected species. And I think any management of any form of wild dog as well really needs to be humane. And there are a lot of methods that are currently used to manage wild dogs, such as leg hold traps, that really are not humane. And we think that is definitely something that really needs to be addressed.
I think there's been some changes in the rules recently regarding control of wild dogs, and that's probably where that's coming from too. I think the truth of the matter is we're probably not across all those details right now, but we can certainly come back and have a talk to you about it. Control of species, you know, to Mari's point, our policy would say that we recognise that sometimes wild animals do need to be controlled, so that for the preservation of other species or human activity. And that's one of those ones where we need to understand and make sure it's really clear and specific. It has to be humane, and it really has to be effective. And we would say it really needs to be and justified, but then it needs to be monitored as well if you're going to do anything to these poor animals to make sure that there's not unnecessary suffering. We probably have at least one more question, if you like.
My question is regarding kangaroos. Unlike other animals, their slaughter can't be regulated because they're shot in the wild. And I've seen a lot of evidence where a lot of animals are misshot, they're left to die a painful, slow death. And any mothers that are killed, their joeys are decapitated or bludgeoned. And I find it very contradicting that when you walk in, you see a big kangaroo and the 5 freedoms, and yet we still sell kangaroo products. And my question is why?
Murray, do you want to answer the question about that? I don't think we do sell kangaroo products anymore. Actually, we took them off the shelves. But the whole issue of authorities to control wildlife, as well as the commercial culling of kangaroos, is really hard. But I think Murray probably help us to understand where that's at and what we think.
Yeah, so Liz is right. There are 2 different systems, and I think there are definitely animal welfare issues with both. So the authority to control wildlife system is a permit system that landholders can use if they can demonstrate that animals are doing damage to their property. They can get a permit to control animals, a whole host of animals, including kangaroos. The problem with that system is that the people that might then shoot kangaroos under that permit system, might not have great skills in terms of shooting those animals. So that could cause quite poor animal welfare outcomes. Then there's also the commercial system that's done under a kangaroo harvest management plan. So in that system, they have to use professional shooters. So they should be shooting with great accuracy, and therefore those kangaroos should have a better death than they might if they were shot by someone that is less skilled. However, I completely agree. There remains the very real welfare issue for joeys, and how those joeys may be dealt with in either system. Young at foot that might get away and therefore might suffer greatly before they might meet their inevitable death if they're not cared for by their mother, if their mother is shot. So I think there's definitely a lot of welfare issues with both. Our position is that we don't think that commercial harvesting should occur, and that any management of animals, whether they're native or introduced, should be justified, effective and humane. And I think that with both of those systems, there definitely is a lot of welfare issues that do need to be addressed.
I think just to add to Murray, I think Murray, in our submission on the Wildlife Act, we discussed that in some greater detail. So if anyone's interested, let me know and I can send that to you. Do we have any last questions? Otherwise we can,
I just wondered, why is under the National Code of Practice for the humane shooting of kangaroos and wallabies for commercial purposes, that the RSPCA is a reference group for that code, and the way the joeys are bludgeoned to death?
I would just say that we will always participate in providing our advice to when they're doing reviews of codes and that type of thing. That doesn't mean that we would necessarily endorse the final product that has been made as part of that process, but we will always work to advocate and influence that process to try and improve the standards and the provisions that are made to, as much as we can, improve the welfare as part of those standards. So I would say that don't take that as endorsement of a code. It just means that we did participate in the process to review them.
And just to add to Mari's point, we do sit on a lot of different reference groups, and we do think it's important to be there for the conversation. So, for example, we sit on the duck hunting wounding, what is it called? Reduction wounding group. And without us there in that conversation, it would be sort of a one-way conversation. So quite often we are one or two voices in amongst a number of other groups, but at least being at the table and being able to provoke, maybe someone has to write an action to follow up something. Maybe someone has to go and investigate costing for something that you've inquired about. Does actually at least keep the conversation, keep sometimes the issues. We may not get exactly where we want to get on it, but we may be able to influence some elements of a plan or some aspects of a policy that would improve animal welfare. Any last questions?
I don't need a microphone. Is it possible you can share the presentation?
Oh, sure. Easy. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming today and for coming online. We will be hanging out in the foyer. Please come. There's so much food out there and drinks. So come and have a chat to us out there if you've got another question. I might leave Mari on the screen like this so you can talk to her. Who'd like that? That would be entertaining. She's like the Wizard of Oz. Anyhow, thank you very much. And I think you would have RSVP'd to the advocating email address. So if you've got any questions, send it through to there or come through to Mari or I, and we can help you out. But thank you so much for your time and for the questions today.